Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you weren't sitting in the previous presentation or the previous Q&A session, because I gave away the answer at the end of the big denouement at the end of the presentation. So I'll try and keep your interest for about 25 minutes. Inevitably, when you're doing a presentation in that sort of time span, you've got to pick out some key points. So this isn't an all-encompassing what's going on in the world presentation, but some of the things that caught my eye over the last few months and trying to look at that. So we're looking at why was the economy so resilient? So you remember that we had the Brexit vote, and people were saying, or economists or the specialists or everyone's saying that the economy would go to pot, and that didn't happen. So I'm going to try and do a little explanation of what went on there, and then try and look at what's going on now and why that perhaps is changing, followed by bringing it close to home. The housing market, the mortgage market where we operate, what are the good things that are going to happen there, what about some of the negatives, and some of the opportunities that arise out of that as well. So I think we start off really with three key points. This has been sort of a really controversial area because Mr. Carney at the Bank of England decided that he'd do a base rate cut. Now, there's many commentators think that was a bad thing, we shouldn't have done it. Other people saying it was the best thing that ever happened. Who knows? But this is what appeared to happen. So the first thing he did was he cut interest rates by 0.25%. What he also did was feed some money back into the lenders as well. He lent us some money, gave us some money at cheap rates, so that helped drive down rates. And then he also did a bit more quantitative easing as well. And so providing liquidity for the marketplace and making it easy for sort of money to flow around. And that led to this happening here, which was that the interest rates fell. You'll have seen and hopefully taken advantage of your clients over the last few months. That's how low interest rates have now gone. So it's now become a really good time for rates. And you know, you might be bravely calling the bottom of the market again. I think I've called it about 4 or 5 times in the last few years. I've got it wrong every time, but I think we are there this time with perhaps the bottom of the market finally hitting. And we did have our little guess late just now as to whether we think rates are going to go up. But that's what happened. So that was the first thing that happened. So we had this drive down for lower rates. And the second thing that helped the marketplace and helped the economy has been this two-part graph here, which is the growth in employment and the increase in incomes as well. The growth in employment has really mystified the economics world, really, because what we've done over the last few years is seen growth in jobs. So we now have 75% of all people employed between the ages of 16 and 64. That's the highest number that's ever come to. 3/4 of all people are working. And at the same time, you might remember that during 2015 and 2016, we had real rises in income. All right, so what we had there was that we didn't have big rises in income. We had very low inflation, which meant people felt better off. All right, so slightly different scenario, but that's actually what happened. And so we had, for 2 years, we remember we had rates around the inflation rates of 0.1, minus 0.1, 0 for a few months, and then towards the end of the last year we saw it rise. So those two factors gave us that real sort of growth spurt, helped us support the economy, because the people who drive the market in the UK economy are us. We spend our money out there, 70% is spent on goods and services that we do. So it's us spending our money that drives the economy. And so we were feeling quite good, we were employed. And just to really emphasise that point on employment here, what you've got is the rate of unemployment. I've gone back a very long time here, 1971, when I was probably studying economics actually. And what you hear is, if you see that line, the blue line there, if you carry it on a couple more months, it actually dips below that red line of what we call full employment. We're at about 4.3%. Now, interestingly, full employment is a point at which incomes should be starting to rise. Because what happens there is something called the Phillips curve. So any of you who've done economics will remember this back in your studying days. And Phillips curve is a very simple relationship between employment and income. If unemployment is going down, income should rise. And that's the real big conundrum the economists are looking at the moment. Why is that not happening? Why are incomes not going up? Because that's not happening. So we've got so that's one of the interesting points which we'll move on to. But we've got this point here where we've got very low unemployment, very high employment rates. People were feeling a bit better because they had some money in their pockets, their incomes were going up, and everything was going well. So, sorry, it's very slow. There we go. But that's all started to fade away. That's all started to fade away. So towards the end of last year, we saw inflation starting to rise, and I was using the Bank of England fan charts they show, where we were starting to expect inflation to hit the 3%, and it looks like we're going to get there before the end of this year. And what that shows here on this graph then is that people's real incomes are now starting to fall again. So they're still getting very low pay rises, but now inflation has gone back up again, so their net's worse off. Inflation's at 2.5%, 3%, you're getting a 1% pay rise because you're a nurse, then you are definitely worse off. And that's what's starting to show through. So real wages have started to lose their oomph and drive the market more slowly than it was. Because again, those are our consumers, those are the people who drive the marketplace. And what people have started to do is actually then spend their savings. So when they're not borrowing money, they're spending their savings. So that also helped to support the market back in 2016. But as you can see here, again, another very long dated graph here. We're all the way over 1963 on the left-hand side. And our savings rate is at the lowest ever level that we've had in that period of time, so over 50 years. We are not saving money. Why are we not saving money? We're spending it to keep our living standards up. We might be buying fast cars and expensive cars, but I believe we're spending it in our supermarkets and keeping the food on the table. And so now people are their income's flattening out, they're feeling worse off, they've spent all their savings. It really is making the economy look really quite difficult at the moment. And hence you've seen growth in the first two quarters of this year at around the 0.3% mark. And maybe we're going to end up around that sort of level again in the quarter we've just finished. This graph feels like it's in the wrong place in this presentation, so apologies a little bit about this. So that's sort of what's been happening over the recent term. So what's going to happen in the future? But one of the things I thought I'd introduce first is another thought that I saw this graph early part of this year, and it was a really interesting one for me. Obviously, you can tell I don't get out very much, but this is the people who own their houses. And you've got two lines on here. The top line, the blue line, is the one which people own it with a mortgage. And you can see that over the last 25 years, we've had a real decline in people owning their properties with a mortgage. On the other hand, people own their houses outright. The red line has gone up in the opposite direction. And in fact, around 2014 or so, they swapped over. So we've now got more people are owning their houses outright and fewer people owning them in mortgages. What does that actually mean? What's happening? What it means is people who are getting as old as me are starting to pay off our mortgages. Okay, so we own our houses, we've got equity, we've got wealth, if you like, in our properties, and young people aren't coming into the market as first-time buyers. So they're not feeding that chain back in again. So we need to really get those first-time buyers back in to drive that market up. Otherwise, our market disappears completely. Or we do some other lending in later life, which is another scenario that's been going on today. So somehow we have to match those two things up. And I think that's a bigger structural thing that we may need to think about over the next 5 to 10 years as that carries on, to see if we can start reversing that trend, helping people to own their own houses. As I say, my thunder's been stolen slightly if you were in the room a few minutes ago on interest rate rises. Again, this was a graph from the Bank of England, and this was their expectation of interest rates in 5 years' time. Okay, so this is a longer term. So what you can see here, it's slightly dated. It's dated about 6 months ago, so their views might have changed recently. But what they were expecting is around the spring, early summer, they were expecting interest rates to be no more than 1% in 5 years' time. That's Bank of England base rates. All right. So if we get a rate rise next month or in the spring or whenever it finally happens, it looks still at the moment where we're going to end up with rates very low still, much lower by historical standards than what we're expecting. We're really not expecting things to go up. But with the state of Brexit and other things that are going on in the world, we can still see downward turns as well, as the Bank of England looks again to perhaps stimulate things again. So that's why I think there'll be a rate rise perhaps, so it gives him some room underneath again if he needs to stimulate the market and what we're doing. Pulling that closer to home again, let's look a little bit at the housing market. It's a little summary of things that have gone on at the moment. And talking about interest rate rises, oh my goodness, like everybody's going to be badly off and it's going to be difficult. Well, you and I both know that many of the mortgages done over the last 5 years have been on fixed rates. So for a lot of people, it's not going to be as big an impact as it might have been in the past, where more people are on variable rates. Just as a minor point on that as well, it'll be interesting back at the ranch at Nationwide to find people who know how to do a rate rise, because it is 10 years since we've done one. So I think there's a real technical thing that I'm sure when all this stuff's coming out, but back at there, the major banks and us at the building societies, we're all working out how we actually process one of these. But I think a lot of people will remain unaffected, so it may not have quite the negative effect we're expecting. The housing market seems to have found a new level as well. I've got another couple of graphs on this later, but we're looking around 1.2 million house sales a year. That's been around the level for the last 3 years or so. That's the market we now need to operate in. That's the sort of numbers that we need to anticipate. You probably need to break it down a little bit for your own personal business levels, but hey, let's have ambition. So there's 1.2 million house sales. That seems to be the level of that. And house prices have started to taper off a little bit. We're now down at around 0.7% for the last quarter, and I've got a little bit more detail on that. The average house price around 210. I think that's one of the most meaningless statistics I ever give out, because it has huge variation in that depending on where you live in the country and whether you're a first-time buyer, etc., etc. But there, it gives us a marker in the sand. So just over the last few years, I think we've done a really good job, you know, in supporting the housing market and doing that bit. So what we had here in 2010 was we had a really low level of transactions, and now we've built that up, and that 4.25% that we're running at the moment is around about that 1.2 million houses that are turning over. So we've gone up a considerable amount over that period in support of the marketplace, and we've driven that, and we've driven the mortgages that supply that house purchases as well. So again, over the last 8 to 9 years, we've seen an upward trend, and we're running around 60 to 65,000 mortgages a month is where we're sitting at the moment. So there's plenty of transactions in there. There's opportunities arising. Those have changed. The shape of those have changed, and we'll talk a bit about how that looks. You can see there we're still well below the long-term average. So we're not going to go back to those days in a real hurry at the moment by the looks of it. So this is a new marketplace that we are operating in, and we need to recognise that. Going the opposite way is house prices. Back in 2014 there, where this graph starts, I was talking about London house prices at around the 20% mark, on the price rises around the 20% mark. And I'll show you the graph in a minute, shows you where they are now. But we've had a real decline in 2015, little pick up in 2016, and now it's really on the way down. And we're looking at around 2%. Annual growth at the moment. That's again across the whole country. There's some regional variations in that, but we're back at the lowest figures we've seen for some considerable years, and that's amplified by the regions. So normally London, where we happen to be today, but London is our driver in the marketplace, and it's all the way over on the right hand side there. We're talking around about the 1.5% growth at the moment. Even a year ago, we were still in double digits. So we really have seen some decline there. And that tends to ripple out across the country. What it is allowing perhaps is for other regions to catch up. Because what tends to happen is we tend to become an economy and that which is very London-centric. It's the only place where anything happens. So maybe if we're losing a bit of the drive from the London area, it'll allow other regions to catch up, allow other markets to evolve, and maybe that's where we should be looking for some opportunities going forward for people. We have actually seen in the last quarter or so actual house price drops in London. I saw a couple of figures, I think it was July's numbers, where we were minus 0.1%. So it's the first time we've seen house price drops for some time. All sorts of reasons for that. Stamp duty's probably got a part to play in there. Maybe the makeup of the bankers as they try and decide whether they're going to be based here or somewhere in Europe, and things like that. So there's a lot of change going on there at the moment. But maybe out of that comes opportunity again. I talked about first-time buyers. Perhaps if the first-time buyers can get some pay rises, get some good jobs, they'll find houses are now more affordable than perhaps they've been in the immediate past. So I just want to summarise those bits for a moment for you. So I haven't really talked about Brexit today. It's just too controversial. I'm not going to talk about it. But we really don't know where that's going to lead us. What sort of impact that's going to have. Good, bad, indifferent, no effect at all. So far, we've done all right in our bit of the market, in our bit of the world. You know, mortgages, houses, we've done all right. We're doing okay. But we'll see where that goes. Rates, we don't know where they're going to go. We've given up trying to guess. Looks like there's more interest in them going up next month. But if they do, they won't go very far and they won't go very fast. and it's a possibility they might come back down again, as we saw in last August in a reaction to what was going on in the bigger world. I introduced my little bit about structural changes. I think that's something that we should bear in mind. I think that's something the politicians should be bearing in mind when they're looking at how we deal with the housing market at the moment. Are there things that we can do to help people into the marketplace and get first-time buyers in? And what do we do with all that equity that us old people are starting to own? And how do we pass it to our children? I think these are the new dynamics in the marketplace. Maybe it isn't politicians. Maybe it's us that need to drive that to support first-time buyers and our children. And house price growth has softened off considerably, despite the fact that we still don't have, we're still not building enough houses, there's still not enough supply. House prices dropped off because people really just aren't buying at the moment by the looks of it, has driven that down. So where else are the opportunities in the marketplace? I like this graph a lot because it shows that the chaos that we're in the first quarter of last year in TMW and the buy-to-let marketplace, we had a huge surge in the buy-to-lets. It really was the worst of times in terms of trying to get customers over the line. We did a reasonable job in the end, but you can see we then had a drop off in there. You'll have all experienced this. And we've levelled off now. This is quarterly numbers around about 18,000 transactions a quarter. At the same time, interestingly, the remortgage stuff has stayed up. And again, I can reflect that in the mortgage works where I work. And we've seen a substantial shift in our business from purchase to remortgage. I guess that's also shown the dynamic where you've now got people using other tools to do the job. Limited company buy-to-let is the obvious one there, a market that we're not in. So it's changing already the dynamics, creating new opportunities, because that's an opportunity which again is an intermediated product that you provide. And that sort of emphasises the sort of flatlining of buy-to-let there. I think David, when we were talking just now, was talking about a £30 billion market for buy-to-let this year. I think that seems about right, maybe 31, 32. We're running at around a 2.5, 2.6 billion pounds a month in mortgages. I think it should be fairly stable around there. On the market as a whole, we've had some good months. August we came in at 24 billion, the best August for about 7 or 8 years, and it looks like we're doing very well at the moment. And virtually everybody I talk to when I'm out and about seems to say they're doing very well, they're busy, there's opportunities out there at the moment. So I think there is stuff to be done there, and there is a market that's feeling robust. Just one thing there on buy-to-let. I think there's a lot been said about the PRA changes. You'll have read it, you'll have seen it, hopefully you've seen emails about it. I think it's been slightly overcooked. What it is all about is provision of information. What we need to do is assess and underwrite that as quickly and as efficiently as we can for you, and that's what we're trying to do. Much of our criteria has not changed at the Mortgage Works, and for many other lenders I think it's similar as well. So stress test rates, LTV limits, all those things that you're used to are still the same. And the key things for us here are business plans and income. That's the two things that we need to have on top of the portfolio. But you'll find we're asking for those proofs of those things in very few cases. So this is going to have an impact on the buy-to-let market, if only that it creates some uncertainty for a while, just slows us down while we think about it, while we digest it, before we perhaps get back to doing something about it again and moving on, as our clients still need somewhere to invest their money. But a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, George Osborne obviously made some sort of decision about how the housing market should look. And I think what he was aiming to do was create some space for the first-time buyer. Whether that's the right thing or not, whether he's got the correct strategies, he certainly had an impact on buy-to-let. And you can see here my right-hand scale, my buy-to-let at the bottom there, levelling out around the 20,000 mark. And our first-time buyer, which is the left-hand scale on the much higher scale, has actually really started to rise again. And I guess if you're sitting in Conservative central office, you might be feeling quite chuffed, really, because you've got what you wanted. You've slowed the buy-to-let market down, and you've brought in the first-time buyers back into market, because your first-time buyer and your homeowner is your natural Conservative lender. I don't know what they think about the landlords and where they vote, because I'm not sure they're quite so happy, but there we go. So that's what we're doing on there. So I think we've really started to see some change there. And this is my way of buttering you all up. I think the reason the market is what it is because of the job that you do. We've got there the intermediary channels. All the growth you can see, the blue bar chart there, has come through the intermediary channels. And in fact, this only shows residential mortgages, so you can add your buy-to-lets onto that as well. So any talk about a change in the marketplace and losing to robo-advice and stuff like that, I think we're just a little bit short of that at the moment. People want advice. So just to summarise those things, the rise of the advisor, you are the key to success in the marketplace and driving that forward. There are opportunities out there. First-time buyers, I haven't mentioned remortgages or product transfers, which are growing areas as well. The first-time buyer is back, which is excellent. And take advantage of the digital world. You're a young room. This is a young industry. Drive that through the digital market as well. Thank you very much for your time.